محمد.
And for the encouragement of the wonderful parents that obviously trained all these children, please reflect on the salawat.
اللهم صل على محمد.
And now, without further ado, we're honored to have on stage Shaan Rizvi joining us for these 3 nights. Sayyid has attended the Colonel University of Law School, where he completed his law degree. He subsequently studied in the Ahl al-Bayt Islamic Seminary in Chicago, as well as in the holy city of Qom. He is now serving as a part of the Al-Hadi School in Houston. We are fortunate enough to have him with us in these 3 nights. Please welcome him with a salawat.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Excuse me, I just reminded myself there is a children's program for all children under 10.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
For your own marhumin of Millat al-Ja'fari, please recite Surah Al-Mubarakat al-Fatiha. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين فاطر السماوات والأرضين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
ولعنة الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي أما بعد. Dear brothers and sisters, Salamun alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First and foremost, thank you for the invitation to City of Denver. It's my first time being here, so I'm really honored to be with a group of Mu'mineen such as yourselves. Inshallah, I pray that I can benefit from your presence and we can be of mutual benefit to each other. Of course, we'd like to start by congratulating all of you on the birth of Imam al-Hujjah, Sahib al-Asr, Imam al-Zaman, Ajalallahu ta'ala, Farajuh al-Sharif.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Ruh روحي وأرواحنا لتراب مقدمه الفداء. As they say in Arabic, that may our souls be sacrificed for the dirt that is underneath the feet of Sahib al-Asr. The topic that I would like to speak about, inshallah, I'll be with you for 3 nights. And the topic I'd like to speak about is regarding the upcoming month of Ramadan. So right now we're at the halfway point of Shaban. And before we know it, as things go in America very fast, we'll be in Ramadan. Okay? So I'd like to use these 3 nights to help us prepare for the holy month, but specifically, what can we focus on in this month? And one of the things that, if you look at what the essence of Ramadan is, it is not for iftar parties, it's not for socializing, right? It's not, of course, there's nothing wrong with some of those things, right? But that is not the purpose of Ramadan, right? That was not the core. Right? That was not the purpose that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala legislated Ramadan for the mu'mineen, for the Muslimin. Right? The Quran says, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, so that you get taqwa. But if we go a little bit deeper, we see in the narrations of Ahlul Bayt that there is a very, very strong emphasis on building a relationship with the Holy Quran in this month. That this is the month of Quran. According to a narration, Inna likulli shay'in baharun wa baharul Quran shahru Ramadan. That everything has a spring, and the spring of the Holy Quran is the month of Ramadan. Okay? So this is the month, and one of the reasons, just as an introduction as to why this month is tied to the Holy Quran, is because what happened during this month, right? The Holy Quran was revealed in its entirety to the qalb of the Prophet in this month, right? And so we see, right, the Ahlul Bayt put a lot of emphasis on building our attachment with this book in this month. So this is the topic I'd like to explore today, inshallah, with your du'as. Please recite a salawat.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad.
Okay, one thing I'd like to say is that I know that it's a festive environment and everybody's in a good mood, right? But right, in order to benefit from these lectures, right, what we're going to be having is a discussion. In order for us to benefit, right, this is a ilmi discussion, meaning that I need people who are here to grow and want to learn. If we see this as just coming here to see our friends and celebrate, we're not going to take as much barakah and as much benefit from this discussion. So I will try to bring the level of the discussion down so we can all benefit. But I need those people who are here to listen to actually, right, be here, try to focus, try to give me their full attention. Please recite salawat. So I'd like to break this discussion down into 3 different topics. Right? When we come to benefiting from the Holy Quran, right, we can focus on 3 different things. And I have 3 nights, and each night I'll focus on something different. So the first thing is tilawa, recitation of the Quran itself. The second is tadabbur, which is reflection upon the Holy Quran, and we'll talk about how to do that. And the third is action, amal. How do you act upon the Holy Quran? When it comes to building a relationship with the Quran, these are the 3 most important things, right? Tilawah, tadabbur, and then amal, right? Acting on the Quran. So we're going to go through these stages. Think of these as stages in our relationship with the Quran. Each of these is important. Each of these has a place. You'll start with tilawat of the Holy Quran, then go to tadabbur, and then on the last night we'll talk about amal. Okay? Please recite a salawat. The first thing we need to understand is, just as a preliminary discussion, that what is the reality of the Holy Quran? What is the reality of this book? Okay. A very simple way to describe it. Perhaps we can compare it to other things we read. Perhaps we're used to reading a lot of texts. As students in school, we might read textbooks. For fun, we might read novels and fiction, right? We've probably read some magazines. We read a lot of social media online. We read news online. Right? We've read instruction manuals. Every kind of text you can think of, we have read it. Now, when we think of the Holy Quran, is it a book just like those other books on our bookshelf? Right? Is the Quran just another book like the other books on our bookshelf? And that's where we have to start. And the answer to that is no. We have to think of the Quran differently. That the Quran is not just another book on the bookshelf, right? Like every other book. What is the difference then between the Holy Quran and the other books we have on our bookshelf? The difference is the Quran is a book of, through and through, the Quran is a book of guidance and personal development and societal development. Okay? Through and through, the Quran is a book of social and personal development and guidance. Okay? So it's very, very important as a starting point to keep this in mind. And this is how the Quran itself describes itself. Right? If you look in the Quran, how does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describe what the Quran is within the Quran? He says, وَنَزَّلْنَا عَلَيْكَ الْكِتَابِ تِبْيَانًا لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ وَهُدًى وَرَحْمَةً وَبُشْرًا لِلْمُسْلِمِينَ. We have sent down the book as a clarification of all things and as a guidance for you. And then he says, إِنَّ هَذَا الْقُرْآنِ يَهْدِي لِلَّتِي هِيَ أَقْوَمُ. This Quran guides to that which is most upright. So the function of Quran is guidance. That is very, very important to keep in mind. That when you're opening any other text, sometimes you read a text just to entertain yourself. Right? Just because I'm busy, I have nothing to do, so I'm going to open this text. Okay? I'm going to keep myself busy. I'm going to read the social media. Right? This is called entertainment. Sometimes you read a text just because you're trying to get tidbits of information. So I might read an article that has information in it, and I try to get information from that. The Quran is fundamentally different from all of those. How? Because the Quran's purpose is to guide you. It's not to give you more information about what you can do in life. It is not to entertain you. It is to give you guidance in your daily life. So now with that understanding, that changes how you sit down with the Quran. When you sit down and you open that book, you sit down realizing that you're sitting with the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in front of the Lord of all the worlds, in front of the divine speaker. Right? And you're trying to benefit from his guidance. So, in order to build a relationship with the Holy Quran, based on what we have said, you cannot treat it like other books. What does that mean? Other books you pick up and you put down whenever you feel like it. You read a chapter, you close it, you fall asleep while reading it, right? You look at your phone, you browse through certain posts, and you close it. Okay, if we treat the Quran this way, that is not called building a relationship with the Quran. And unfortunately, many times we see that sometimes when we interact with the Quran, it's like this. What happens, we have a calendar on our wall with Quranic ayat, for example, or we have something on our phone that gives us reminders from the Holy Quran. And we think of that as our connection to Quran. What I'm saying is that because the Quran is a divine book, and it is a book from the divine, we have to, first and foremost, treat it as such. Meaning that when we sit down to read it, it can't just be on the go. It can't be on the fly. We have to give some attention. Farsi, we say we have to give some tawajjuh to this book. Right? Tawajjuh meaning attention. Okay, when you give that attention, anything that a person gives attention to, right, that is going to take hold in his heart. Right? Anything that a person gives attention to psychologically, that will take hold in his heart and in his mind. Now, for example, right, speaking to the youth, right, if I'm really into basketball, and I love basketball, and let's say my favorite thing is playing basketball or practicing with a team. Okay? So what do I do the night before? I get my gym bag ready, I make sure my shoes are clean, I know exactly what time my practice is, I make sure I have a ride there, and I make sure I'm there. Why? Because that is important to me. Okay? The first step in building a relationship with the Quran is having that tasawwur, that realization of its importance. Without that tasawwur, without that realization that this is a book that is sent for your guidance, we can't build that relationship unless you know the maqam, right? Unless you know the status of the Holy Quran. Until you know that and accept that, that relationship is not going to be there. Please recite the salawat. And I will just say this, right? Because we have a lot of people here with young children, some people with a little bit older children, but this is also a very important point. That, and I realize that there's no resident alim here, so some of these ideas are a little bit harder to transfer to children without an alim in the community. But inshallah, like mu'mineen who are struggling to make things happen, it's definitely still possible. One of the ideas that's really important is teaching our children a level of hurma and sanctity for religious symbols and religious objects. So, if you go back into Muslim culture, there's a story of one of the ayatollahs, I forget his name, but after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, he was laying down, he was tired, and so he told his students that, I'd like to rest in this room. So they made his bed, and he was about to lay down in that bed, which was on the ground. And as he was about to lay down, he kind of got up and he turned the bed. And so his students asked, like, what's going on? Like, why are you moving the bed? And so he said that the way you made me lay down, the way you set this bed up, my feet were facing the picture of Imam Khomeini. And so therefore I don't like that my feet will face the picture of Imam Khomeini, therefore I'm turning my bed this way. Okay, what is the purpose of this story? The purpose is that there is a certain hurma for certain things. There's a certain sanctity that we have to teach our children. And that is very hard living in the West. Because in the West, you're not born with this idea that certain things have a value above other physical things. Everything is on the same plane. Okay, so our relationship, this is just a tangent, but when we teach our children about the Quran, they also need to learn to respect the physical Quran as well. The mushaf of the Quran as well. We're going to talk about reading it and the contents, but this is a very important idea. Just as that Ayatollah did not want to face the picture of Imam Khomeini, so too we should also teach our children not to disrespect the Holy Quran, if it's on the ground, pick it up, not to drop it, not to be careless in carrying it, not to put, if we're packing the Quran, not to put it next to shoes, etc., etc. It's a very important idea. Right, please recite a salawat. So I was told I don't have too much time because it's a Thursday night. Everyone has to go home, go to sleep, get ready for school or work. And so just to introduce this idea of building a relationship with the Holy Quran, just to start it. Right? Starting with the first level, which is tilawah and recitation of the Quran. And then we'll get to deeper and deeper levels. But the first level is just reciting the Quran. There's some really, really beautiful narrations from the Ahlul Bayt that are important to reflect on here. That the Imam says that regarding recitation, just recitation of the Quran, he says, without a doubt, a house in which the Quran is recited and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is exalted and is remembered, it is a house whose blessings will multiply. The angels will visit that house, the devils will abandon that house, and it will glow for the dwellers of the heavens as a bright star glows for the people of the earth. As for the house in which the Quran is not recited, nor Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala remembered, its blessings will diminish, the angels will desert it, and the devils will visit it. Now, I don't know about you all, but for me, hearing this narration, right, from Imam Sadiq is very, very powerful. This is enough. Meaning I don't need to go and, for me, this is enough to want to recite the Quran in my house, want to have the Quran recited by other people in my house, without even getting to the level of tadabbur and tafakkur and amal. Just the plain recitation. The angels come into your house, the devils leave your house. These are real things, right? These are real realities that we have to take seriously. The shayateen are real, that we invite these shayateen into our home. How? Through social media, through the internet, through these influences we get from the outside world. They come, right? They live with us. They exist with us, right? And they corrupt our minds, they corrupt our hearts, they corrupt, our religion. So we need to work on expelling these shayateen and clearing our thoughts and our mind. One of the ways to do that is recitation of the Holy Quran. Okay. Now, when we talk about reciting the Holy Quran, there is also a adab and a way to do it. Not every recitation is the same. So the guidance we have from the Ahlul Bayt on this point, from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wa sallam. Inna li kulli shay'in hilyatun wa hilyatul Quran sawtul hasan. That everything, according to Prophet Muhammad, he says that everything has an adornment. What is an adornment? Adornment is a beautification. So everything has something that beautifies it. So for example, if you want to beautify your home, you decorate it. Right? If you want to beautify the masjid, mashallah, as these volunteers have done, and you put up these decorations. Similar to that, the Holy Quran also has a beautification. That beautification, according to Prophet Muhammad, is a sawtul hasan, which is a beautiful voice. Which is a beautiful voice. So when you are reciting, when you're doing tilawah, right, what is encouraged is to recite with a good voice. It doesn't mean you are a qari. It doesn't mean that you need to recite at that level. It just means you need to try to beautify your voice just a little bit. Right? Just a little bit. Okay? Now you can see the difference. Right? We have stories of when you listen to someone reciting the Quran with that sort of melodious voice, you can feel that difference, right, in your soul. And there's an attraction to that. And that's why we have the story in Islamic history where the king of Ethiopia, when the Muslims migrated to Ethiopia, the king of Ethiopia was not a Muslim. Right? He was a Christian fellow, but as the Muslims went there in the early period, because they were being persecuted in Arabia, so some delegation of Muslims went to Ethiopia. And when they went there, the king, who was not Muslim, welcomed them, and they had a dialogue with him. And one of the things they did was recite to him the verses of the Holy Quran. And as the story goes, he was so touched just by this melodious recitation that just by hearing that Quran, he was so moved that he was willing to become allies with the Muslims and give his resources to the Muslimin who had come to him for support. Please recite salawat. And so there is in these words, there's a depth, right? There's a melodiousness in these words that can shake you, right, to your soul if you are reciting properly, if you are listening properly. And that is why that this has always been, for the Muslimin, one of the great arts of Islamic civilization has always been the recitation of the Holy Quran, right? The spoken word, and related to that, poetry. If you look at all the arts in Islamic civilization, right, one of the things that has taken pride of place is recitation, tilawah, and poetry. Now, we don't have, there's certain arts that are not permitted within Islam. Right? For example, dancing is generally not permitted within the Sharia. Other art forms may not be permitted within the Sharia. But the soul still has a need for beauty. Right? Your nafs, your soul, has a need to connect to beauty and to appreciate beauty. How do we do that as Muslims? One of the ways traditionally has been through the emphasis on poetry, through the emphasis on recitation, through the emphasis on the spoken word. So this is something that, inshallah, if we can inculcate this culture of recitation, of being able to recite well, of being able to recite and kind of use this tool of communication that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us to inspire ourselves, right? To connect with other people, that will be a step forward for us. Please recite one more salawat. last thing I want to say about tilawah. So far we said that, right? We talked about the merits of tilawah, that it brings the angels into the home, it takes the shayateen out of the home. Then we talked about the tilawah that is done with a sawtul hasan, which is a beautiful voice. The last thing I want to say is that the Prophet is told in the Holy Quran, Surah Al-Muzammil, وَرَتِّلْهُ تَرْتِيلًا, that recite this Quran with tartil. Like to recite this Holy Quran, the Prophet is told by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, although many of the commands to the Prophet were also intended for the mu'mineen. Meaning sometimes we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the Prophet something in the Quran, but the intended audience was also all of the mu'mineen. So here he tells the Prophet, recite the Quran with tartil. Now, this is also important. When it comes to our tilawah, what is tartil? The tartil means that you are reciting the Quran slowly and in a measured pace, so that you can pronounce all the huruf and all the stopping points, all the wuquf. Okay? It means that you are going at a pace in which all the pronunciation is proper, right? Meaning the ains, right? The different letters that you're pronouncing. It's not too fast, right? But it's also not too slow, right? It's a pace in which you can also reflect. It's a pace at which you're able to reflect on what you're reading. Now sometimes, right, what happens? If you're reading the Quran too fast, you're obviously not going to be able to reflect on what you're doing. If you're reading the Quran too slow, you're also not going to be able to reflect, because if you go too slow, naturally what happens is your mind actually starts wandering in between the different parts of the Quran that you're reading. Right? So your mind will start wandering. So tartil is a measured pace. Right? Now, what did Imam Sadiq alayhi salam say about tartil? Please recite a salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. وعن الصادق عليه السلام إنه سئل عن هذه الآية. So Imam Sadiq was asked regarding this ayah, وَرَتِّلْهُ تَرْتِيلًا. The Prophet is told to recite the Quran with tartil. So that a man comes and asks Imam Sadiq to explain, well, can you explain this ayah, what is tartil? So Imam Sadiq says very beautifully that, he says, فَقَالْ قَالَ أَمِيرُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامِ بَيَّنْهُ بَيَانًا وَلَا تَبُثْهُ حَذَّ الشَّعَرِ وَلَا تَنْثُرْهُ نَثْرَ الرَّمَلِ وَلَكِنْ أَفْزَعُوا قُلُوبَكُمُ الْقَاسِيَةِ وَلَا يَكُنْ حَمُّ أَحَدِكُمْ آخِرَ السُّورَةِ. So he says that when he's explaining what tartil is, Imam Sadiq says, recite the Quran slowly, with deliberation, recite it well, and do not recite it hastily, meaning with too much speed. Don't recite the Quran hastily as you would recite poetry. Don't recite the Quran as you would recite poetry. And don't scatter those ayat as you would scatter sand. What? Meaning that you have to be deliberate in what you're saying. Right? You have to be measured in what you're saying. And the Imam says, awaken qulubakum al-qasiyah, your hearts that have been hardened, with this recitation. Use this recitation to awaken those hearts that have become hard. And do not, when you are reciting the Quran, do not let the concern of any one of you become reaching the end of the surah. Do not let the concern of any one person be reaching the end of the surah in his tilawah. And that's a very heavy statement. Okay, but some of the urafa, we'll talk about this actually tomorrow as well. But the Imam is saying, at face value, if we look at this narration, that sometimes we set ourselves up for failure from the beginning, because we say that we need to for sure read this many ayat. Right? Our kids need to recite these 4 or 5, 6 surahs every day. Okay? This surah I'd like to recite, but it's too long. This is not the right approach when it comes to giving our children love for Quran. Right? This is not the right approach. Yes, there is room to give them, there's room to set goals for them and to help encourage them. Right? But when we are trying to build a relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when that relationship is not something that involves doing the wajibat, we have to be a little bit careful in what things we are committing ourselves to. Okay. The purpose was not to recite a certain number of ayat in the Holy Quran. The purpose, according to Imam Sadiq, was to awaken your heart. Now, that awakening can happen with 10 ayat. For someone else, it might happen with 50 ayat. It might happen with 100 ayat. But that was the goal. And that was the whole purpose of recitation. If you have said to yourself that my goal is instead 50 ayat or 100 ayat, that's also good. But that is not the end-all, be-all in recitation of the Holy Quran. We'll talk about that a little bit more. One of the things that Imam Khomeini says that is also worth sharing is that this is something that we can also do with any dua. Right? Any dua that we have that we're reciting, we don't need to be people who think that this is an all or nothing dua. And actually, again, I'm citing this statement on the authority of Imam Khomeini, that he says that anytime you're reading any dua, it is not necessary for you to make a commitment to recite that entire dua in one sitting. When was it required in Islam that, for example, if you're reciting dua Makaram al-Akhlaq, dua Abu Hamza Thumari, dua Kumail, that you recite the entire dua in one go? Sometimes we would like to recite dua Kumail, but we don't have the time for it. We don't have the energy for it. We don't have the presence of heart for it. So Imam Khomeini says that in those cases, just recite half of it. Recite 1/3 of the dua, because that is better than not reciting anything. And that is better than not reciting anything. So these are important ideas to keep in mind as we try to find our place in America as a Muslim community here, that when we are giving our kids some of these things, there is a lot of flexibility within Sharia. There's a lot of flexibility within Islamic tarbiyah. It's not how we have necessarily done things in the past. Okay. The last thing I'll say about tilawah is that, right, this is something that, right, when we recite, right, because recitation is something that can have an effect on our soul. And according to one of the senior teachers in the Hawza of Qom, what he said, right, and this makes sense in accordance with all the narrations, is that just the recitation itself, meaning before you get to tadabbur, before you get to amal, just the recitation, because of the rhythmic patterns that exist within the Holy Quran, if you are reciting with tartil, which we've talked about what that is, if you're reciting in that rhythmic way, then due to the patterns that exist, just reciting those patterns, it will have a very positive effect on your soul. It will have a very positive effect on your soul. Okay? Something to keep in mind. Last point I'll make is that, right, when it comes to our intention, of course, there is the fear that perhaps we do things sometimes, whether it's adhan or recitation of the Quran, with the intention to impress other people. And of course we know in Islam that if you have that intention, then there is no spiritual value to that action. Meaning that action is not bringing you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in any way whatsoever. If your niyyah is not in some way tied to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, one of the ways to protect against this, according to some of the higher level ulama in this area. Again, I'm not an authority on this, and this is why I'm basing this lecture on, like, what has come down from very esteemed, reputable ulama who have done work in this area. Now, one of the ways that to protect ourselves in this situation, right, is always to remind yourself that I am reciting this Quran because I want this recitation to have an effect on my soul first. Right? I want this to affect me. I'm doing this for myself first, and inshallah other people can also benefit from it. But because I know that this recitation will also have an effect on me, then that is my niyyah. It's not to impress other people, it's not to, right, to go go further and, create a name for myself, etc., etc. Okay. So with that, I'll leave it here. I know we have Dua Kumer coming up. Inshallah, this is the same discussion. I'd like to go a little bit deeper tomorrow and the next day on how we can build a relationship with the Holy Quran. Okay. Please recite a salawat. Tomorrow's lecture will be on tadabbur and the idea of reflection and how we can use that to build a relationship with the Quran. And then we will go to the third stage, which is amal, and acting on the precepts of the Quran. Al-akhir da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
Thank you.